Hello and welcome to Wizards, Warriors and Words, a fantasy writing advice podcast. My name is Jed Herne, author of Fires of the Dead.
Hey, I'm Michael R. Fletcher, author of Beyond Redemption and, I don't know, a bunch of other books. What's up?
I'm Rob Hayes, author of the War Eternal trilogy and the Ties of Bind trilogy and many other series.
And I'm Dyrk Ashton, film professor, knucklehead, and author of the Paternus trilogy. And I just want to say, Michael R. Fletcher has a book releasing today, Ash and Bones. Go buy it.
Congratulations.
I forgot. Sweet, thank you.
At a time when this episode comes out, that might actually be a few weeks in the past, but the important thing is that you can buy it if you are listening to this right now or watching this. So today's episode is all about editing. I think it's quite easy to fixate on when we're talking about writing advice, first drafts, coming up with ideas, outlining things, but it can be a little bit less resourced in terms of the knowledge out there about editing and everything. So I thought we could discuss, just to start this off, what our editing processes look like and what you kind of do once you have finished writing that initial first draft. Rob, do you want to kick us off?
Okay. Well, I take time off after I finish that first draft. That's where I am right at this moment. Actually, I'm at the end of a week off after having written a book. So I think you do find that bit of advice quite a lot. Actually, just sort of the step back. Once you've finished it, just take a step back and think about something else. Do something else. Let it sit before jumping back into an edit. I think that's actually quite a good piece of advice. Gives you a bit more distance.
You generally, what is the sort of the average time that you would take off from a book if you have a sort of average time for it, or does it just depend on what you're working on?
I'm a glutton for punishment, so for me it's like 2 days unless it's enforced.
Wow, okay, that's a pretty quick turnaround time. Dyrk, what about you?
I would prefer to be able to take like a month off or two, the Stephen King method, but in general, it has never happened. It's always immediately right into the rewrites. One thing that might help for new people is if we define what we mean by editing.
Oh, good point. Let's do that.
Right, because there's editing, there's rewriting, there's different kinds of editing. So I don't know if you want to address that.
Yeah, well, if you want to talk us through how you define those terms, that'd be really useful.
Okay, I mean, I'm a rewrite. I consider myself a rewriter. My first drafts are incredibly rough. I write them very quickly. I don't worry too much, other than the first book, which I took a long time to write, and a long time to write the other ones, but a really long time, where I would craft the sentences and the paragraphs as I went. And there are a lot of authors that work that way. I know Nick Eames works that way. But in order to keep myself moving, because I'm such a slow writer, I write really, really rough. I don't worry about the sentences. I don't worry about the word choices. I want to get the dialogue out, the setting out, and sometimes I'll leave a note in brackets for myself. They walk into this area, describe, right? And then I'll just keep going. So I don't spend too much time, talking about the ambiance or whatever. And sometimes I'll do the same thing for some exposition or fight scene,
Yeah.
And I know who's going to win and who's going to lose and what the outcome is, and I'll write that. But then I have to go back, and I immediately jump right back into what I call a rewrite. It's not an edit, as far as I'm concerned. And I have to go through and clean up and fill in all that mess. And then I don't really call things an edit until I've gotten notes from other people, proofreaders, beta readers, things like that. Then I call it an actual edit. And that might be the third or fourth draft. My first draft is really an unreadable draft 0. So that's the process that I go through.
I'm really glad
and
to hear
everybody's different. As far as how they write. And I know people who can write, 10,000 words a day, and it's very, very clean, very clean. And they'll put out, 12 books a year, 10 or 12 books a year.
I don't think that's real. People can't actually do that.
I never thought that either. I thought, oh, good, fast, and cheap, right? You can't have all three. If you do it fast, and you're doing it yourself, so it's cheap, it can't be any good. But I have been proven wrong.
Oh, I know it can be. I choose to believe that those people don't exist because it makes me feel a little bit better.
Yeah, but you and I know some of them.
I know. I mean, I'm lucky if I put out 2 books a year. It's like 12 books, like one a month is just like,
yeah.
Or even 5 a year just blows my mind. But we know a lot of people that do that.
It's true.
And they're well written.
But I mean, in terms of editing, the rewriting thing, I call that editing as well. I mean, I think I'm in a similar camp to Fletcher in that we're kind of more pantsers than planners, or however you want to term it. So I think for me, in your sort of terminology, my first edit would be a rewrite, because I don't know where I'm going with the story when I first write it. It's only towards the end of the story where I'm like, okay, this is where I was going, this is what I wanted to say, this is who my characters were. And in that first edit for me, it's bringing it all in line with the vision that I had by the end of the book, if you get my meaning. So at the beginning of the book, I have it in my mind, I've got this kernel of an idea, and by the end of the book it's sort of like it's grown into something else. And then that first edit for me is just going back and going, right, okay, this character who was this in the beginning but in this in the end needs to be changed to be more in line with who they are. And I need to foreshadow these things that happened towards the end of the book, even though at the beginning I had no idea they were going to happen, so I couldn't foreshadow them.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of editing can be as much storytelling at that point, rather than, a lot of people think of editing as mostly technical, craft kind of stuff. But a lot of it has to do with, definitely has to do with, making the story better, and maybe even changing it a little, making it more consistent. One thing that the King book is kind of worthless for the most part, but there are a few things that I really hang on to. And one was that, don't worry about everybody talks about what's the theme, what's going to be the theme, the underlying theme or lesson, or, of the book. And he says, don't worry about that until you're done. And then once you've set it away and reread it again, then think about what the theme is and go through and fill that in. And that has helped me tremendously, being able to do that.
I assume the theme for your books is don't get attached to my characters.
Yes.
Nice.
Yeah.
Mike, do you want to talk us through your editing process a little bit?
Sure. So I'm like Rob, mostly a pantser. I can blast a 100,000 word first draft in about 3 months. So what I used to do was finish the first draft, and basically when I typed the end, I'd go back to the beginning and start fixing all the crap, tightening sentence structure and stuff. And then one time I was like, you know what, I should have some distance. And so what I did was I took 3 months away from the book and accidentally wrote another book. Now the problem was, at the end of that book, I now had 2 books totaling, I don't know, close to 275,000 words between the 2 of them, that needed editing. And so I spent, if I write a book in 3 months, I'm going to spend 3 or 4 months editing it. So two books a year is pretty good for me. But I mean, I spent then 6 to 8 months just editing, and it was hell. It was fucking terrible. I hated it. By the end, it was just brutal. And so now I'm like, no, fuck that. I'm not doing that again, because editing 2 books back to back, you spend so much time away from writing. By the time you're done editing, you're like, how the fuck do you write a book?
Mm-hmm.
I just had no idea. I didn't know how to start. So I after editing 2 books, I had to learn how to write a book again, which was silly. So now I finish a book. I basically skip to the first chapter. My first pass will be just tightening sentence structure, catching stupid mistakes, tweaking things so that they line up with however things were at the end of the book, much like what Rob talked about. You know, if I have an idea halfway through a book, I will write the rest of the book with that idea and not go back and fix the first half until I'm done. So that first pass of editing rather is all that fixy stuff. I'll do like 7 or 8 editing passes before I send it to a beta reader. And then I'm always like, here you go. This is the first draft, so it's a little rough.
That is the first draft. There's a draft 0, which is when you finish a book, and then there's the first draft, which is when you finally send it to somebody else to read and hope that it's not really bad.
Yeah, but there are several in between that we don't.
Oh yeah, a ton, but they don't exist.
They're not different drafts. They're just different edits.
Yeah, people are like, "Oh my God, you're like, this is so clean." It's like,
just what Michael mentioned earlier is actually, I think, some of the best advice that you can give a new writer is that if you do change something as you go through and come up with a new idea, go with it. That's fine, but don't stop before you do that and go back and fix everything, because you'll get in a never-ending feedback loop.
That's it.
Where you'll never finish the book, and that happens
a lot.
Yeah, a lot of authors get lost in that edit, and they'll sit there and go, "Oh, I keep writing half the book, and then I'll rewrite it, and then I'll rewrite it, and then I'll rewrite it," and that's kind of a big issue. You need to, as you just said, just write through the entire thing, and then fix whatever needs fixing at the end. If it needs a massive rewrite towards the end, that's fine. There's no problem with that. Yeah. But yeah, get it down, get it written first, and then go back.
It's like there are a couple of sayings. I think it was Peter McLean? Peter McLean? How's it pronounced?
It's McLean.
McLean? Yeah.
I think it's McLean.
Okay. Talked about the first draft is just dragging the log into the workshop, and then you can start carving on it later. And Joe Abercrombie talks about just throwing all the sand in the sandbox, and then you can start making your castle in the rewrites. Well, he also talks about vomiting it out on the table and then cleaning it up later. But that, if you can take that to heart, it really does make a difference. You'll get books done. Yep. If you can do that.
Do any of you go into an edit with a specific idea in mind? Like, I sometimes I'll sit down with a book and say, right, I want to go into this edit and focus mostly on one thing. Like I'll say this edit is going to be focused mostly on sort of bringing out the characters a bit more and making them more individual.
Yeah, absolutely that. And sometimes it'll be like one plot point that has a thread that works through the entire book. And so I'll do an editing pass where I have to go through the entire book just to tighten that one plot point all the way through and make sure it works. And it's funny because I will see typos and character mistakes and all kinds of shit. And I'll be like,
skip it.
Nope, I'll get you later. I will. I'm not even going to look at you right now. That's not what I'm on.
That's really hard to do, but multiple types of passes help for me a lot. Yeah. Like if I use the word roar or enormous, 800 times, I'll try to hit that last. And I still have some work to do on that for book 3, believe it or not. It's already out.
To be honest, when a book's that long, you're going to reuse words, Dyrk.
Yeah, sometimes I get, I'm catching,
A trick that I actually found helped as well, not with sort of specific edits, but just with sort of catching things like the way a sentence flows is to do the read aloud. So, when you're sort of reading through it, instead of just doing it in your head, read every bit of it aloud. And it really helps you figure out which sentences just don't flow or don't sound right.
It really does. I hate doing it, but it wasn't until I read my first audiobook and I was like, oh shit. And so I started that. My last edit was basically done while I was narrating the audiobook because it was like, oh fuck, this sentence is awkward and it's totally different and I hate it.
Yeah. Another thing that I find useful on a similar note is, I don't know if any of you do this, but changing the font. So much of the editing process is about trying to get insane. Objective.
Yep.
And
I'll change the font, change the font size.
Yep.
And it looks weird.
Well, I don't know about size, but I definitely changed the typography. That's interesting. You change
Well,
size.
and it'll also help me catch like double spaces between sentences.
Don't you just do like a find all, remove?
I do that too. Yeah.
Well, doesn't like a general spell check just find the double space things?
No,
Really?
I have to search. Well, not with Word that I use. I have to specifically search for double space, but it'll find them all. It's easy, and then I just find and delete. Hit replace all with a single space. Works great. As long as I remember to do that, I have to have a list, right?
Yeah.
Of all the things I have to search and try to fix.
Oh, that's
Now,
right. That's the list is a good
that's-
point.
Yeah,
I have a list of words.
Yeah.
I finish a book with a list of words that I now have to hunt and mostly murder, where it's like I've just used it a million times.
I have to search things like wide or drops because I have a whole lot of their eyes getting wide and their jaw drops. So I have to, I have words like that I have to search to find, and I still leave way too many.
My list quite often consists of things like titles. So, I'll have like, there's an emperor in this story. So I'll have emperor written down because I have no consistency in capitalization with that, like titles.
Mm-hmm.
Captains, emperors, it doesn't matter. It's just like, I will randomly capitalize them and randomly lowercase them just all over the place.
Yeah.
I
have a whole list of names too.
When it works.
I have a whole list of names because I use a lot of very strange names from mythology, and a lot of them have different letters and accents and stuff like that. And when I'm writing, I don't worry about any of that. So I have to search all the multiple versions of all those names because I'll spell them differently. Like one name I'll spell differently 12 times. 12, I'll spell it 12 different ways, I mean. So I have to go and search
it. That doesn't surprise me. They're all like 60 characters long and like there's no vowels in any of them or whatever.
There are some like that, yeah. Or lieutenant. Words like that I always spell wrong. So I make a note to search that.
Maneuver.
I can't spell the word colossal. Like, what the fuck? Colossal. Can't spell it.
Yeah, well,
like 10
is it 2 L's and 2 S's or 2 S's and 2 L? 1 L? Is it 1 S? Yeah. No,
it's like,
exactly.
it's big.
Yeah, and my big ones are like your, and your, there and there, it's and its. And for some reason, I have no idea why, and my editors make fun of me every time. I always leave the first N out of lightning. So it's always just lighting. It's just a mental block I have. I have no idea how that happens.
Wow.
I think everybody has that with certain words where it's just like the brain just cannot seem to write them. Or at least the fingers can't. I have certain words that my brain knows how it's spelled, but my fingers just mess it up every time.
Exactly. Like lightning.
Yeah.
We are almost out of time for this episode. If we could... First of all, Rob, I think you have our featured book for this episode. Sorry to put you on the spot. I didn't tell you about that before we started recording. And then we will have just a quick few minutes to wrap this up. I definitely think we should be doing another editing episode soon because we've come up with a lot of good stuff in this one. And I think, a lot of useful pieces of advice here. So Rob, do you want to take us away with our book for the episode?
Sure. I know we're supposed to pick our own books, but I'm not going to again. So I'm going to say, you should all go and read The Sword of Cagan by M.L. Wang, partly because it was the champion in last year's Spiffbo self-published fantasy blog off, and partly because it's a truly astounding, heart-wrenching, emotional gut punch of a book, so you should all go and read it. Or listen to it, because the audiobook is coming soon, and I got to listen to it before release, and it's really good.
Nice. So that is a sort of, how do you say it again? Sword of Cagan? Sword of Cagan by M.L. Wang, and I will put the link to that in the show notes as always. So just a quick few minutes before we wrap up.
I wrote that one.
Every book.
Can't take credit for every book. Just like 80% of them maybe. But anyway, before we wrap up this episode, do we have any other quick thoughts about editing? Perhaps we could talk about maybe the most useful thing that we've sort of stumbled across when it comes to editing, whether that's a tip or a thing like, changing fonts? What is kind of the most useful thing you've picked up with editing over the various years of writing?
For me, it would be every scene, read it through, take a moment and decide whether or not you can picture it really well in your head, and if you have actually written what you have in your head. Because often I will have a scene in my head and I will write it, and most of it stays in my head and not on the page. So then I go back and go, okay, what have I actually shown the reader here? And that's when then I start talking about like how the corpses smell, and getting into sort of the nitty-gritty details of the scene and putting the reader there.
That's fantastic.
That's my tip, yo. It's fucking fantastic. That's right.
Adding in sight, smell, taste, touch, those things really, really help. I mean, they sound mechanical and they can feel mechanical if you don't write them correctly, but they really help draw people in. The other thing is with me, the big thing with me is that here is a description of what's happening, right? And it's 3 paragraphs. Can it be just 2 paragraphs, right? Can it be shorter just in the way it's worded? Or am I kind of repeating myself or writing stuff? It's really hard to look at something and think, I really don't need that. Or I've already kind of hinted or said that. I don't have to go into any more detail on it and cut it back. And that's tricky, but that's been really, really critical for me in as far as readability and pacing.
Kill your darlings. Rob?
Oh, yes. I think for me, the biggest one is hire a professional editor and listen to them, because they know what they're talking about.
Oh, yes.
I can't count the number of times where I've had an edit back from an editor, and I have the stages of grief, and it starts with anger. You read through the edit and you're like, well, screw you, what do you know? And then you come back to it and you have a bit of sort of refusal to accept, and then eventually it comes down to the point where you're like acceptance, and you're like, yeah, all right, you know what you're talking about, fair enough. And yeah, quite often it might lead to just like, okay, this sentence which I absolutely love, and then the editor's saying doesn't work, you're like, all right, it doesn't actually add anything, I can just get rid of it.
Right. And nobody will ever know. And I love that you said that, because I go through the same exact thing. And then I finally make the decision, whether it's story or writing or whatever, I make the decision by, well, if I change this, will I still like it? And if the answer is yes, then just change it, because they're probably right, especially if I get feedback from a number of people. If it's something I'm going to change and I just won't like that about the story or about the writing, then I won't. But if I'm ambivalent one way or the other, then I just go ahead and change it, and it doesn't detract.
Awesome. All right, well, that has been a really great episode. Thank you, everyone, for listening or watching, and we will see you next time. See you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Wizards, Warriors, and Words. We hope you learned something useful. Let us know what you thought about this episode in the comments below. We'll do our best to respond. We'd also love to hear your questions. Comment with your questions below, and we might even answer it on the show. If you haven't already, please subscribe and like this video. This helps more people discover the show. Wizards, Warriors, and Words is jointly hosted by Dyrk Ashton, Michael R. Fletcher, Rob J. Hayes, and Jed Herne, with editing by Jed Herne. Our music comes from Michael R. Fletcher, and our artwork is by Felix Ortiz. Thank you again for watching. Now go and write extraordinary stories. We'll see you next time.